In the heart of America's untamed frontier, Kansas was a place where civilization barely reached and where darkness ruled the land, where lawlessness and the unknown walked hand in hand. Welcome, brave viewers, to a land where the Wild West met the supernatural, and where the rugged and unforgiving landscape was not for the faint of heart. Amidst the howling winds and endless prairies, pioneers, settlers, and homesteaders lived side by side with outlaws and cowboys, and they all battled not only the elements, but also forces beyond their comprehension. They faced the darkness that lured beyond the flickering candlelight, beyond the whispers in the shadows, and beyond the chilling tales told around the campfire. But it was a place also torn apart by human selfishness and depravity. And in this maelstrom of turmoil, violence, and superstition, the Bloody Benders, a group of 4 people who claimed to be a family, were given the opportunity to take root and to act out their horrific deeds. Between May of 1871 and December of 1872, at least 11 travelers on the Osage Trail vanished, and their whereabouts were traced to an unassuming one-room cabin just 10 feet off the trail. By the time the Benders were uncovered, they had fled their homestead, leaving behind the bodies of their victims buried in the orchard behind their cabin. And those on the scene were left with the memories of the vivid scent of death that clung to the very air surrounding the Bender property. Today we are taking a journey back in time to the barren landscape of the Kansas frontier, where the Bloody Benders committed their nefarious acts under the cover of darkness and turned their small cabin into a house of horrors. Hello everyone, happy Harloween. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another creepy Harloween video. I'm so excited to record this video today because it's been a long time since I found myself so entrenched into a true crime case, and that's mainly because of the history and the mystery that surrounds the lives and crimes of the Bender family, better known as the Bloody Benders. Now, I often find myself drawn to stories of the past because it really does feel as if they took place in another world, a world that I myself and most of us have never lived in, a world where there weren't cell phones and surveillance cameras tracking our every move, and those who had violent tendencies and desires could literally move unseen and unknown, oftentimes never being identified and never being brought to justice for their crimes, leaving behind a mystery that endures. I was also surprised that I had never heard of this story because it is truly compelling and, in my opinion, falls in the same category as the devious deeds of figures like H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper, who get far more recognition and exposure. So I cannot wait to start weaving this story for you, but before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Native. I love talking to you all about Native because these are products that I know and love, products I've used every day for years, and now you too can explore all that Native has to offer with their Best Sellers Pack. With Native's Best Sellers Pack, you can enjoy every part of your shower routine with their body wash, deodorant, and deo and body spray. And you can rest easy knowing that their products are clean, simple, and effective, and they'll keep you smelling good all day. Their classic deodorant provides long-lasting 72-hour odor protection. They are aluminum and paraben-free, vegan and cruelty-free, and they use ingredients that you know, like coconut and shea butter. Plus, it's great because the texture isn't sticky at all. It feels dry when you're applying it. You don't have to do one of these just waiting for your armpits to dry for 5 minutes before you can put your clothes on. I love it. Now, Native's body washes, probably my favorite Native product, they use naturally derived plant-based ingredients to help clean your skin, along with citric acid for pH balance to keep your skin extra happy. They're phthalate and dye-free, vegan and cruelty-free. They foam up so beautifully, and they leave your skin feeling silky smooth with no weird residue left behind, and they don't leave your skin feeling dry or tight like some body washes do. Now, the deodorant and body spray from Native applies light as air with a cooling mist that dries on contact. They're easy to apply, and they provide instant odor protection. Plus, they double as an all-over fragrance spray. Now, these sprays are powered by air, made with only 6 ingredients, including nitrogen, which is an ozone-friendly natural propellant. And the best best thing is that all of these products leave you smelling great. It doesn't matter which product you choose. It doesn't matter which scent you choose from Native's wide range of scents that are certain to please everyone. They have everything, whether you want something sweet, something spicy. These are the 3 scents that I've been using most recently, and I've been using them together because I think they pair very nicely together. So in the deodorant, we have the citrus and herbal musk, which you guys know has been one of my favorites forever. My favorite of the deodorant and body spray is the sweet peach nectar. It smells so good and pairs wonderfully with the citrus in the deodorant. And then for the body wash, I've been using this one, and this is actually new to me this month. It's aloe and green tea, and I just don't know what it is about this scent. It's light, but still really noticeable. So it just smells very clean, very fresh. I love it. I love it. Right now, you can get your best sellers pack from Native, which would normally be $36, but if you use the link in my description box and enter code StephanieH37, you can get your deodorant, your body wash, and your deo and body spray for only $24 at 33% off. That is a deal that's hard to not take advantage of. So take advantage of it now by clicking link in the description box, using code StephanieH37, and start falling in love with Native, just like I have, just like so many others have. Thank you so much to Native for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. So, as always, to understand what happened at the end, we have to go back to the beginning, and for this, we're going way back. Because long before the Bloody Benders made Kansas their home, it was a place already marked by bloodshed and tragedy. And that's not really the way we look at Kansas, right? Because now, today, no offense to any Kansas people out there, I personally at least look at Kansas as someplace, pretty boring. Not in a bad way, just like it's not a place you hear about a lot. I think about, Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz, Wicked Witch of the West, tornadoes, but I don't think about this incredibly illustrious and interesting and violent history that happened long before any of us were alive. In the years leading up to the American Civil War, Kansas was a turbulent and pivotal territory in the conflict over the issue of slavery, and it would become known as Bleeding Kansas due to the violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups. And this is simplifying things greatly. I can't give you the entire history because that would take hours and hours, but I suppose if we had to mark where it really started, it all began when California entered the Union as a free state in 1849, and this upset the balance between free and slave states in America, with free states now taking the lead. This caused these opposing forces, who desperately wanted to hold the majority in Congress, to keep fighting it out through politics and in the streets. Adding to the pressure of an already boiling situation, there were also unresolved questions about whether the new territories added to the United States during the Mexican-American War, specifically New Mexico and Utah, would they be free or slave states? And this led to the Compromise of 1850. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky proposed this compromise, wanting to reduce tensions and try to appease both sides in an attempt to avoid a war between the northern and southern states, which might eventually lead to the dissolution of the Union, kind of like the Civil War. So it was decided that Utah and New Mexico would be left to decide the issue of slavery on their own by the principle of something called popular sovereignty, meaning the people who lived in these territories would vote and settle on whether they would enter the Union as free or slave states. And although popular sovereignty would be used again in the future, this was the first time that it was enacted in the United States, and it was quite controversial, to say the least. So as many of us know, if we took history classes in high school, the United States gained vast amounts of land as a result of the Louisiana Purchase that happened in 1803, and by the 1840s, the government in the United States was interested in establishing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska in portions of land that were still unorganized, and they wanted to do this because of, westward expansion. They wanted to encourage people, settlers, homesteaders, to move from the East Coast and kind of like start going out west where there was a bunch of empty land. A lot of that land wasn't empty. As we know, there were indigenous people living on it, but that is a story for another day, and also we're going to touch on it later in this video. Now, in the past, when new territories would be established, Congress would decide whether or not they were going to allow slavery there based on the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And the Missouri Compromise laid it out pretty, clearly. Slavery would not be allowed north of a specific boundary between Missouri and Arkansas, and Kansas and Nebraska did fall north of this boundary. However, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed the Missouri Compromise, which pissed a lot of people off, and then left these new territories to decide the issue of slavery based on popular sovereignty. It was always kind of a given that Nebraska would become a free state, but Kansas was still up for grabs. And this caused a rush of pro- and anti-slavery supporters to basically flood the territory in an attempt to influence the vote on slavery. Pro-slavery forces from Missouri, that were known as border ruffians because of their tendency to move back and forth over the border when it suited them, they crossed into Kansas on March 30th, 1855 to vote in favor of slavery during the first territorial election. And then they went back to Missouri. They didn't stay in Kansas. This shouldn't have been allowed, but hey, it was. And what happened is it resulted in many pro-slavery people being voted into the legislature, and they got right to work, immediately passing pro-slavery laws, including making the possession of abolitionist literature a capital offense in Kansas. Now, at the same time, anti-slavery settlers began establishing free state communities and forming their own government, specifically in Lawrence, Kansas. And this led these groups to be denounced as an outlaw regime. Before long, the rivalry between pro- and anti-slavery groups escalated into violence, including raids, arson, and armed clashes. The most notorious of these armed clashes being the Sack of Lawrence, which took place on May 21st, 1856, when hundreds of border ruffians once again crossed into Kansas from Missouri and entered Lawrence. They set fire to buildings, they destroyed the printing press of the area's abolitionist newspaper, and basically caused chaos and fear. However, no lives were lost. No one was killed. But there is no doubt that the sacking of Lawrence ignited the flames between the opposing forces, and not long after this, abolitionist John Brown led a violent anti-slavery uprising at Pottawatomie Creek. Brown and others forced 5 men from their homes along the creek and killed them in cold blood to send a message. If you mess with us, we're going to mess with you. But all it did, as these violent kinds of situations usually do, is escalate the violence and cause retaliation. So between 1856 and 1859, roughly 55 people were killed as the Civil War raged on, and those in power were not behaving much better. So this isn't a funny story, but it is it's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. And you just couldn't imagine something like that happening today. Actually, given the state of politics and the rising tensions, I actually could. I could imagine something like this happening today, which is sad. So Senator Charles Sumner, the Republican representative from Massachusetts, he gave a moving speech on the Senate floor in Washington, D.C., denouncing popular sovereignty and saying that the violence and bloodshed happening in Kansas was a disgrace. And he placed the blame for all of this squarely at the feet of Stephen Douglas and Andrew Pickens Butler, the Democratic senators who had drafted the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this upset many members of the Senate, including Sumner's own cousin, Preston Brooks, the representative from South Carolina. On May 22, 1865, in retaliation for his speech, Charles Sumner was rendered unconscious after being beaten to a pulp with a cane that was wielded by his own cousin, Preston Brooks, and it happened right in the Senate chambers. Now, it's believed that between the outright violence that was happening in Bleeding, Kansas, along with the fact that Brooks faced almost no repercussions for his horrific act, these events and popular sovereignty and basically leaving it up to the states to decide things on their own, it set the country on the path to the inevitable Civil War, which would become one of the deadliest wars in American history, pitting brother against brother and friend against friend. Over time, the anti-slavery settlers did outnumber their pro-slavery counterparts, and Kansas would enter the Union as a free state on January 29th, 1861, just a few months before the Civil War broke out. Now, after the war, Kansas would end up playing a significant role in the abolitionist movement, and they would become one of the first states to grant suffrage to Black men. And in the years that followed, the territory experienced a major influx of new settlers, mainly from the eastern United States and from Europe. The construction of a railroad system only increased settlement and development, and Kansas would transform from a very divided territory to one that ended up thriving. They became known for their agriculture and their progressiveness. They were not progressive enough at that time to have respect for the native peoples of Kansas who'd been occupying that area for hundreds of years. Because after the war, pressure on the United States government to open more land to settlers saw the forced relocation of the Osage Native Americans from southeast Kansas to what was then called the Indian Territory, which is today Oklahoma. Now, this newly freed land in Kansas was made available to homesteaders. The American government offered anyone who could afford an $18 claimant fee 160 acres of land, and if the settlers proved that they were able to survive the harsh elements of the prairies, they could work hard, improve the land, and maintain it for 5 years, those 160 acres would be theirs to keep. Now, this may sound basic, right? Like $18, 160 acres in land, sign me up, you know? You can't even rent a studio apartment for under $5,000 these days. So yeah, I'll take those 160 acres for $18. All I have to do is survive and flourish. However, it was not as easy as we may think. Between 1865 and 1890, millions of people moved their entire lives and families hundreds and thousands of miles away, lured by the promise of fertile soil, open prairies, and a better life. Lured, honestly, by the promise of like, oh, you're living in big cities, you're overpopulated, you're all packed together, like come to the country where you'll be safe. But the glittering dream was far from the reality that waited for them. First, they had a long and treacherous journey by horse and wagon that many did not survive. Homesteaders then arrived to Kansas to find that there was not fertile soil. The land was actually very difficult to farm due to low rainfall. And they also encountered very harsh weather, swarms of locusts that would attack whatever crops that were able to grow, and a lack of building materials and supplies. Because honestly, there just wasn't a lot of ways to get these building materials and supplies out to these isolated prairies. And if that wasn't bad enough, there was a growing culture of lawlessness on the Kansas frontier. Cattle towns sprung up along the new railway lines, and these were not little home-on-the-prairie places filled with young families looking for a better life and churning butter. These railroad cow towns were rough and tumble settlements that aimed to meet the needs of restless and rowdy cowboys, filled with saloons, dance halls, gambling rooms, and sex workers, making them the perfect environment to attract those who were running from the law and those who wanted to live outside of it. Kansas was also a path that many notorious outlaws would take to reach no man's land, which was a strip of 210 miles that bordered Kansas, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. And basically, for a long time, this area was not a state or a territory, and therefore it wasn't really subject to the laws of the United States or anywhere else. And you would have these outlaws, these criminals just hanging out there, but they wouldn't stay there, right? Because there's nothing there. It's just land. They would go into Kansas and the surrounding territories to get supplies, to rob people, to steal their horses, things like that. And in general, many of the newly created frontier outposts during this time had no real organized law enforcement. The army was kind of supposed to be in charge. There weren't really police stations. There wasn't really anything like that. So this left many of the citizens of these settlements to create vigilante groups once they felt that no one would be coming to save them from the growing lawlessness that surrounded them. And so they had to take law and order into their own hands to protect their families and their communities. One of these places that had, their share of vigilante groups but no organized law enforcement was Labette County, established in 1867. And by 1870, it was already less settled than other parts of the Kansas Territory, and it was a place where people would just kill each other over land disputes, or where drunken brawls often ended in murder and bloodshed. In October of 1870, 4 people, an older couple in their 60s and a younger man and woman, arrived at the trading post of Edward Earn and Rudolph Brockman in Osage Township. That was in Kansas. And they said they were looking for some land. The younger man, who appeared to be in his 20s, introduced himself as John Gebhart. And Gebhart introduced the older man as John Bender, often referring to him as Pa. The older woman was introduced as Ma Bender, and no first name was ever given for her. And the younger woman, who was described as being in her 20s, shapely and pretty with long red flowing hair, was introduced as Kate or Katie Bender. Now, it was never explicitly said, but it was assumed that these four people were a family. Locals would come to believe that Ma and Pa Bender were the parents to both John and Kate, who often referred to themselves as siblings. But many young men who had become transfixed by the pretty young woman often noticed that Kate and John sometimes exhibited a familiarity with each other that suggested there was more intimacy between them than would be expected from blood relatives, if you know what I mean. So the Benders would eventually choose 160 acres of land between a chain of low hills that today bears the name the Bender Mounds. And these hills crossed over what is today U.S. Highway 400, but in 1870, the rugged Osage Trail ran between these hills. The trail's origins can be traced back to Native American trading routes and footpaths that had existed for centuries. And as settlers began arriving in the area, the existing footpaths were adapted and expanded for the means of trade and travel, playing a large role in the establishment of new communities along its path. Now, the Osage Trail ran for hundreds and hundreds of miles, but the specific section of trail that we're referring to today, for the purposes of our story, ran 47 miles between St. Paul and Independence, Kansas, and passed through some really rugged terrain and dense forests, making travel on it difficult, especially during times of bad weather, like the winter. According to Susan Jonasis, author of Hell's Half Acre, The Untold Story of the Benders, quote, lightning struck at anything exposed. Deep, cold nights punctuated warm spring days, freezing unsuspecting travelers in their tents. Great floods burst riverbanks and swept ill-prepared pioneers into the churning water. End quote. I mean, it's, the Kansas frontier. It's the Wild West. There's going to be other things you would encounter when traveling on this trail because you're not in a car that goes fast. You're not in a car that you can lock. Usually people traveling this road, depending on what they were traveling it for, were just exposed on horseback or sitting in these kind of slightly covered wagons, but not really. And how fast can a horse really go? So a lot of travelers on the Osage Trail were often left open and vulnerable to bandits, horse thieves, which apparently was like a huge issue in Kansas at this time. Horse thieves. It's not funny. Once again, somebody's horse getting stolen isn't funny. I don't want anybody to get upset and say I'm insensitive. But it's funny because today, we worry about car thieves and we worry about parking our cars outside of our house or in a parking lot and then some stupid TikTok challenge encouraging a bunch of ruffians to steal our car. But back then they had to worry about horse thieves. And horse thieves, if caught, did not face a lot of forgiveness. Some believe the Benders chose this area of land specifically because of its close proximity to the trail, because the Benders would go on to build a small one-room cabin on the south side of the trail, like I said, just 10 feet away from it, and inside they hung a canvas sheet separating the cabin into two separate spaces. The back of the cabin was where the family would sleep, while the front was used for a public space, including a small inn and a store that sold basic groceries and supplies like ammunition, gunpowder, grocery items, tobacco, and alcohol. Now, since the landscape was fairly isolated and travel on the Osage Trail could be slow and arduous with food and safe lodging often hard to come by, the Bender cabin would go on to be host to many guests who wanted a hot meal and a safe place to rest overnight before continuing on with their journey. Now, the older Benders, Ma and Pa, were known to speak mostly German, with Pa sometimes able to carry on a conversation in broken English, but that was rare because for the most part, the older Benders had no desire to talk to or socialize with anybody. They were always seen scowling, they made no attempts to make friends or create social bonds, and locals would sometimes hear from travelers that they would be chased off Bender land by the old man and his gun. Now, John and Kate Bender, the younger Benders, they did both speak German. John Gebhardt had a German accent that you could hear. Kate really didn't, but we know that they both did speak German because they would often be heard communicating with the older benders in that language. The younger benders were far more friendly and outgoing, even if no one could really figure out what their relationship was, and this would become a much enjoyed topic of gossip in the homesteading community. The younger benders did make moves to create friendships and ingratiate themselves with their neighbors. They were both charming, they spoke fast with a lot of energy, they smiled often. Now, looking back, many people said maybe they weren't charming and friendly. Maybe they were manipulative. Maybe they knew exactly what to do and how to behave in order to make people feel like they were nice. Like they were nice young people that were very kind and normal. Now, John was described as being a handsome and strong young man, though he did have this unsettling habit of letting out a sudden high-pitched giggle at the most random times, oftentimes more than once in the course of one sentence. And this led people to believe like maybe he wasn't all there. Maybe he'd, been through something that had slightly changed his brain. And this was why he was doing this weird giggle thing all the time. Kate was known for her warm and easy way with people that put them at ease, even if they were meeting her for the first time, especially if those people were men, because men, whether they were local or traveling through and stopping at the Bender Inn, they were very drawn to Kate's fiery red hair and her hourglass figure. They were all hoping and praying that Kate and John were actually brother and sister. However, like I said, based on the way Kate and John behaved with each other, not many people believed that they were brother and sister. Not long after her arrival in Labette County, Kate Bender began advertising herself in the local papers as a trance medium who had the power to heal, and she was known to go on local tours of the area, lecturing about spiritualism and free love in order to promote her business, and inviting people to the Osage Trail in the early hours of the evening, promising that she could communicate with the other side. Kate Bender identified as a spiritualist, and for those who want a deeper dive into spiritualism, I have an entire video about it, but for the sake of this video, I'll give you the important points. Spiritualism was a belief system and a religious movement that emerged in the mid-19th century, mainly in the United States and Europe. Now, at the core of spiritualism is the belief that spirits of the dead can communicate with the living, but only through a medium who serves as a bridge between the physical world and the spirit world. Spiritualism in America is believed to have been born in Hydesville, New York, with the Fox sisters, 14-year-old Maggie and 11-year-old Kate, who told their parents and neighbors that they were hearing strange knocks on the furniture and walls at night. Soon, crowds would gather in the Fox cabin to watch Maggie and Kate communicate with the spirit who was behind the seemingly unexplainable noises. The girls would ask questions out loud, and their spirit would knock in response. And this led to the Fox sisters uncovering that their ghostly visitor had been a traveling salesman who'd been murdered and buried beneath their house. Now, if you want to know what happened with the Fox sisters, like I said, I've linked the spiritualism video in the description box. Go and check it out. It is one of my first videos, so I may be a little rougher, I may be a little less comfortable, but great story. The mid-19th century in America was marked by many factors that made it the perfect time for something like spiritualism to take root. Mortality rates were already high due to disease and poor medical intervention, but when the Civil War took the lives of hundreds of thousands of young men, the people left behind, widows, mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends of these men killed in the Civil War, they were desperate for a way to speak to their loved ones, even if it was just one more chance, even if it was just to say goodbye because they had sent them off to war, not really understanding that they wouldn't come back. And if you're familiar with Civil War history, I am. It is one of my favorite wars to research, that in World War II. You'll know that most people on both sides of the aisle, the North and the South, they kind of thought that this war was going to be quickly fought. You know, the North thought that they would take over the South within a couple of weeks and be back home. The South felt that they had the upper hand when it came to weapons and soldiers, so they thought it was going to be a quick war, and it ended up not being a quick and easy war. It ended up being really brutal. Really, really terrible. So at the root of spiritualism was the deepest and truest hope that a human being can hold in their heart. You know, I can have some closure. I can speak to my loved one who's gone, who I didn't expect to be gone, and tell them I love them, tell them goodbye. And hopefully, you know, both of us, myself and my loved one, can move on in our own planes of existence. And there was also an aspect of a turning away from traditional religions that left people grappling with questions about their own lives and deaths. And it didn't take long for these mediums to figure out that there was money to be made from people's deep and unrelenting grief and confusion. Those from all walks of life began sort of dabbling in the supernatural, something that would have been considered taboo and even illegal in past decades. Mary Todd Lincoln had 4 sons with her husband and President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, but only one would survive childhood to become an adult man. After their 3rd son, Willie, died of typhoid fever in 1850, Mary's loss and grief had her turn to spiritualism, and she became involved with a group of mediums from Georgetown. The White House would see Mary host several seances, some of which her husband was present for, and she claims that she was able to speak to her son Willie, which I guess in the end brought her a great deal of comfort. After her husband was shot at Ford's Theater, Mary even had a spiritualist photographer produce a portrait of her, which appears to include the ghost of Abraham Lincoln standing behind her. Now, of course, this photographer, William H. Mumler, was later proven to be a hoax, and honestly, whatever temporary comfort Mary experienced from this movement, it didn't contribute to her having a very happy life in the end. As she became more and more entrenched in spiritualism and seances and talking to the dead, her surviving son Robert became concerned about Mary's erratic behavior, her obsession, and he had a court institutionalize his mother in 1875. Mary Lincoln was in a sanatorium for about a year before being released into her sister's care, but from that point on, she and Robert, her son, were estranged, which is tragic because you know that Mary loved her children so much. She became wrapped up in this fervor, hoping for a way to still be able to connect with them. And this would lead to a complete disconnection from her only surviving child. It is a sad irony. Self-proclaimed mediums like the Fox sisters and the Davenport brothers, who were from Buffalo, New York, they would go on extensive tours of all the major cities in the United States. They became household names. But those who believed and practiced spiritualism were not limited to big cities or to, these famous mediums that would be reported about in the papers. And the Kansas frontier, where one was consistently faced with the realities of life and death, it was a breeding ground for spiritualism. Aside from Kate Bender, 5 other families in the area boasted at least one medium in their household, all women, and many others in the area took advantage of the services that these ladies had to offer. Kate would run seances where she would bring forth the spirits of the dead, and she also sold papers on which she claimed to have written charms for protection, fertility, and good luck. She and her closest neighbor, Susanna Tyack, who allegedly also had psychic healing powers, they were known to host circles where they would communicate with the dead or cast healing powers. And Kate Bender was especially popular with her male customer base, who had a hard time closing their eyes when she told them to during seances. Instead, they wanted to stare at the beautiful, voluptuous young woman in front of them, who was described as having a tigerish grace. Now, the Benders had only been settled on their new land for a few weeks when they found themselves at the center of a scandal. Remember, the local trading post was owned and run by 2 men, business partners, Rudolph Brockman and Edward Ern. Well, Ern had a girl back in Germany who he wanted to marry, and when he had made enough money from his business venture, he wrote to the girl's mother and asked for her daughter's hand in marriage. The proposal was accepted, and Ern brought both the young woman and her mother to Kansas. Now, at that same time, Edward Ern decided it was time to split off from Brockman, his business partner, and he wanted to open his own homestead and store. So while he was choosing a new plot of land, he had his betrothed and her mother stay with the Benders. At first, everything went very smoothly, and the 2 women from Germany became very close to the Benders in general. They spoke the same language, which was the reason that Edward Ern wanted his, future wife and her mother to stay with the Benders. And they especially liked John and Kate, who were socially outgoing, friendly, and hospitable. One day, Kate suggested that they all take a walk. But shortly into this walk, Ma Bender made a big show of claiming to be out of breath and unable to go further due to her bad hip. So she and Pa returned to the cabin before the other 4. When everyone got back a little bit later, Ern's future mother-in-law went to go look for her jewelry box, but she couldn't find it anywhere, nor could she find several cashier's checks totaling $3,200. And this was the only money that she and her daughter had in the world. The Benders were accused of stealing the money, but they denied any involvement, saying someone must have entered their cabin while they'd been out on a walk. And since there was no evidence of any wrongdoing, nothing ever happened. But the incident did remain in the minds of some people who had always been unsettled by this odd group of 4. By 1871, the Benders were running their little inn without incident, although there were comments about how messy and cluttered it was, and how there seemed to be a constant layer of dust and grime all over everything, including the plates and silverware that Kate was serving meals on. Many also commented on the amount of flies that seemed to have taken permanent residence in the cabin, and there was always the smell of something sour and foul that lingered in the air inside the cabin. Still, it was a safe place to wait out the night in what was essentially a wilderness, and like I said, many travelers found themselves drawn to Kate Bender and her warm and easy way of interacting with them. Now, at that time, Kate was also working as a waitress at the Cherry Vale Hotel, where she met fellow waitress Julia Hestler. So Cherry Vale was actually one of the earliest settlements in Kansas, and therefore it was more developed than the areas around it. So it had, a schoolhouse, it had a hotel, and most people from the surrounding areas would send their kids to the schoolhouse or find work in Cherry Vale. And Cherry Vale happened to be only 2 miles away from the Bender cabin. While working together, Kate and Julia Hestler became close, and they would often talk about spiritualism. They'd even done a few seances at the hotel. So when Kate invited Julia over to her cabin for a seance in the spring of 1871, Julia accepted, thinking nothing of it. And it was a very easy and, slightly quick trip from Cherry Vale to the Bender cabin by stagecoach. But when she arrived the night that the seance was scheduled for, Julia was surprised to see that the only 2 people present were herself and Kate. And she was like, oh, I thought this was a seance. Usually there's more than 2 people there. There's a bunch of people and they all sit around in a circle and hold hands. And Kate was like, no, tonight the spirits told me that it would be easier to contact them if there was less people around. So that's why it's just you and me. And Julia said, okay. And she walked inside and she was immediately struck by the strong and unpleasant smell that lingered in the stale air, as well as hordes of fat, glistening flies that were buzzing around her constantly, to the point where Julia found herself having trouble focusing on summoning the spirits of the dead. So Kate Bender had Julia sit at the table in the front part of the cabin, and Julia's back was to the canvas sheet that separated the back of the cabin from the front. And Kate sat across from Julia. She told her to, close her eyes and focus, and then Kate began murmuring the words that would supposedly drop the veil between the human and the spirit world. At some point, the whole situation between the flies, the smell, and the growing warmth in the Bender cabin became so unpleasant and uncomfortable that Julia's eyes snapped open. And this revealed in front of her a different scene than had been there when she'd first closed her eyes. She and Kate were no longer alone because while Julia's eyes had been closed, the other 3 Benders had silently crept in, and they were now standing behind Kate. And Julia said that Pa Bender was holding what looked like a large hammer in his hand. Julia felt her heart skip a beat, and then her heart quickened, and she muttered something about having to use the bathroom before abruptly standing up and making her way to the door of the cabin. Her pace picked up when she realized that she was silently being followed by the Benders, and she broke into a run. But according to Julia, she was pursued by all 4. And as she dashed out into the dark prairie, she could hear several gunshots ringing out behind her and footsteps in close pursuit. She could also hear the Benders arguing amongst themselves in German as they tried to locate her. Julia Hestler's account of this would later be published in the Frontier Times, and she claimed that Kate was reprimanding the other 3 for not being fast enough and for letting Julia get away. As the bobbing lights of the Benders' candles and lanterns continued to follow her, Julia ran faster, managing to escape whatever situation the Benders had in store for her. It was shortly after this that travelers on the Osage Trail began to vanish. The trail was the only way to travel to the Osage Mission, which today is St. Paul, Kansas. Many people had business in Osage Mission because it was at that time the most important settlement in southeast Kansas, and it became the gateway for commerce and exploration in the frontier territory. They had banks there, places where you could get loans, places where you could get a lot of supplies, including building supplies. And there was also a land office located there, so any homesteaders would have to first apply there before being granted acreage. In the fall of 1871, James Ferrick, his wife Mary, and their young son arrived in Baxter Springs, Kansas from Ireland with hopes of finding a better life and more opportunity on the Kansas frontier. James was employed by a railroad company laying tracks, and he was constantly traveling for his job. So eventually, he decided to relocate his family to Howard County, and this was a place that was more settled and where he felt his wife Mary would have people around while he was working on the railroad. In Howard County, Mary and James Ferrick became close with their neighbors, the Wattons, a couple in their 30s who had 7 children. Now, in December, Mary Ferrick planned to bring their young son to New York City to visit with her sister for the holidays, and after James dropped them off at the train station, he set off on the Osage Trail on horseback, headed for Howard County and his new plot of land, where he planned to stay with the Wattons for a little while he built a home for his little family, because he really wanted to have it completed by the time his wife and his son returned to Kansas. When Mary Ferrick arrived in New York, she wrote to her husband to let him know that they'd arrived safely, but she never received a reply. When days and then weeks had passed with still no word from James, Mary got very worried, and she was also afraid to go back to Kansas since she didn't know where her husband was. There was no way to contact him. She didn't even know if she would have a home to go to. Mary would eventually receive a letter, but not from her husband, James. Instead, she got correspondence from her friend, Mrs. Watton, who informed Mary that no one had heard from James since he'd left Baxter Springs. And this was right after he had dropped his son and his wife at the train station. Mrs. Watton also added some sinister context, stating that James Ferrick had started his journey on the hard Osage Trail during the worst weather of the season, and it was likely that he had not survived. In 1872, cracks began to show in the Bender group. Ma and Pa Bender had always been miserable and unsociable, but the younger, John and Kate, had been their redemption in the community. However, the 2 younger Benders were also now showing signs of discontent and misery. Kate had been performing as a medium at a local boarding house where she was very popular with its residents at first because of her warm and open demeanor, but it soon became known that she had started threatening to lay curses on those who refused to pay for her services, and there were whispers that Kate Bender was a witch. Additionally, travelers who stopped at the inn regularly began to notice that getting Kate in a good mood was honestly hit or miss for a while. Sometimes she was her normal, friendly, and gracious self, while other times she seemed moody and sullen, as if she didn't want any conversation, as if she didn't want them there at all, which was weird because they're paying her to be there. People also began to notice that young John Gebhardt would often be gone for extended periods of time, allegedly conducting his business, but no one really knew what that business was or where he was going. But still, the Bender cabin was pretty much the only game in town, and it was so close to the Osage Trail, so they kept getting paying visitors. In late March of 1872, a group of people who were walking along a river encountered a terrifying sight. It was a campsite surrounded by human body parts that eventually led them to a pile of clothing, flesh, and bone hidden underneath a blood-soaked pile of hay. Not far from this pile of hay, they found a stockinged foot with no body attached to it. Because the body had been there so long and had been feasted on by animals, which is why the body parts were strewn all over the campsite, there was no way to make an identification, but it was discovered that the body had belonged to a man who was dressed in 3 shirts when he had died, and his head had been caved in by a blunt object. They could tell this from the skull. A few weeks later, a farmer shot 2 coyotes who were having a violent and loud fight on his land, and when they were dead, he discovered the object they'd been wrestling over was a bloody blanket. At the end of September that same year, 2 young brothers were fishing in Big Hill Creek by Cherryvale, and very close to the Bender cabin, actually. But their youthful fishing trip turned into a gruesome discovery. First, they happened upon a ragged dress caught in some bushes with a dark stain on it that looked like blood. Not far from this dress in the same bushes, they found a men's shirt. And floating in the creek, the boys eventually came upon the body of a man who ended up being identified as William Jones. Now, Jones had left his wife Martha and their children in Montgomery County at the end of September, and he'd set off on the Osage Trail, headed to Osage Mission, where he was doing some teaching. They had a very big school there, there, actually. It was initially a school for Native peoples, and when they were unceremoniously kicked out of Kansas, it became a school for the settlers, and actually it became a very well-known school that people from all over the United States would send their children to. So on his way back, Jones had planned to stop at the land office and pay off his debt with the $250 that he carried with him. Martha never saw her husband again, but on October 17th, she read the description of a man that was printed in the paper. And she read that this man had been found dead in Big Hill Creek from a blow to the head that had completely crushed in the right side of his skull. He had also had an extensive neck wound. When the community found out that William Jones, a good man with a clean reputation, had been stolen from his wife and 3 young children, leaving them with no way to provide for themselves, an investigation began. R.M. Bennett, the man who owned the land that Jones's body was found on, claimed that in the early morning hours, a week before the body had been found, he'd heard something outside of his cabin. Bennett said that it was the sound of a wagon, but he noticed it because of the discordant rattle that the wagon gave off. Men who went to the spot where Jones had been found discovered faded wagon tracks with a distinctive feature. From carrying weight that was too heavy for the wagon, one of the back wheels had twisted in a way that would have caused a wagon to give off that discordant rattle Bennett had been describing. In the following month, 3 more men left for business, headed down the Osage Trail, and they never came home. And so rumors began to fly around the communities dotting the trail, with people whispering to each other that they could have a murderer amongst them. The Osage Trail had never been a walk in the park between horse thieves, opportunistic bandits, and the elements. But the discovery of the unidentified man at the campsite and the body of William Jones, this was a level of outright violence that was something very few people had seen. Leroy Dick was the township trustee of Cherryville, and he wrote everything off as, normal disappearances often seen in travelers of the remote areas of Kansas. He had multiple people coming to him with their fears that this seemed to be outside of the norm. This seemed to be a pattern developing, but he never publicly acknowledged it because he didn't want to trigger mass terror and chaos. And obviously, the homesteaders needed to feel safe, right? They needed to feel like they could live in Kansas safely. They needed to feel like they could travel on the Osage Trail safely to get what they needed, to apply for more land, to get supplies. And if they didn't feel safe, they might retreat back to the bigger cities. And no one really wanted that. So yes, it was politically motivated. In November of 1872, Leroy Dick received an unexpected visit from his cousin, Henry Mackenzie. Now, Henry, who went by Hank, was traveling the trail from Cherryvale to Independence, Kansas, to visit his sister and to apply for some land. And he stopped in to stay the night with his cousin before he began his long journey. Leroy didn't really like his cousin Hank, who was known to be very extroverted and brash, full of colorful and exaggerated stories of his time fighting at one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War. So when Hank took off the next morning with $36 in his pocket, Leroy was honestly happy to see him go, despite the recent incidents on the Osage Trail. Now, although Hank may have made some fictional additions to his war stories, Leroy knew that his cousin was still young, strong, athletic, and a good trained fighter. So he didn't think much of his cousin Hank traveling along a path that had recently led others to their violent deaths. Now, as a spoiler alert, something that Leroy Dick wouldn't find out until the bodies were found in the orchard behind the Bender cabin, his cousin Hank never made it to Independence. Around this same time, another man, Benjamin Brown of Cedarville, also set off down the Osage Trail, headed for Osage Mission, where he planned to get a loan that would allow him to purchase land for his growing family, which included his wife Mary and their 2 young children. Yes, a lot of people's wives in this story are going to be named Mary, and it's going to be a little confusing. But so far, I think we have 2 Marys and 1 Martha, and we're going to get at least 2 more Marys. With $50 in hand, Benjamin Brown was full of hope when he arrived in Osage Mission, but his dreams would be shattered when he was denied the loan due to his lack of credit. He stood for a moment outside of the loan office, debating what to do next. Benjamin Brown remembered the vivid picture he had painted for his wife Mary before he had left on his journey, a picture of the life that he was going to create for them, a life that would mean having their own land, working their own soil, providing for their family off of, their sweat and hard work. And he knew he could not return to Mary empty-handed. So instead of heading back to Cedarvale, Brown made his way to Independence, thinking he might have better luck at the land office there. Now, when her husband didn't come home, Mary Brown set off on her own journey, riding by stagecoach along the Osage Trail and stopping at settlements along the way to ask if anyone had seen Benjamin, but no one had. When she finally turned back around to return home to her children, Mary was not only empty-handed and broken-hearted, but exhausted from the long and hard travel, so she stopped at a small inn for some food and rest before continuing on to Cedarvale. The inn was the Bender place, and Mary was so warmed by what she perceived as the family's genuine concern over the fate of her husband that she ended up feeling comfortable and welcome enough to stay the entire night, even though she had just planned to get some food and rest for an hour or so before continuing on. In the following months, 2 more men left their families in Howard County and headed to Independence to visit the land office and to find new places for their families to live, since Howard County was becoming more populated by unsavory characters and it had become significantly more lawless. George Burton was the first to leave, and his friend William McCrotty followed shortly after. Now, both men had stopped in Ladore, but only George Burton made it to Independence. In Ladore, Kansas, McCrotty ended up speaking to a man named Dan Gardner, who told him that the Bender Inn would be a safe place where he could get a hot meal and spend the night. And then he was never seen again. In late December of 1872, the body of a man was found, dumped on the prairie. This man was later identified as John Phipps, and his father informed the authorities that Phipps had been traveling the Osage Trail with $300 at the time of his murder. That same month, a man named George Longcore was preparing to head out on the same trail with his 18-month-old daughter, Mary Ann. Now, this is a very sad story because the Longcores had already faced so much adversity and loss and tragedy. George Longcore was a Civil War veteran who had arrived in Onion Creek, which was 7 miles south of Independence, with his wife Mary Jane and their infant son in 1870. And they'd set up their homestead, and they'd quickly become fixtures in the tight-knit community. George was a blacksmith, and he was a good one, so his services were in demand. They were doing well for themselves. George was working the land. Mary was helping when she could, and the couple became especially close to their neighbors, the Yorks, who included Dr. William York, his wife Mary, and their 3 small children. The York family will also become very important to this story. By May of 1870, the Longcore's son had fallen ill, and he was diagnosed with lung disease, and he died before the month was over. On January 12, 1871, Mary Jane Longcore gave birth to another child, a daughter that they named Mary Ann. But within a week of delivery, Mary Longcore had died due to complications during childbirth, and this left George to raise their daughter alone for roughly the next 2 years. Although his neighbor, Mary York, helped as much as she could with the baby, when Mary York became pregnant with her 4th child, she needed to pull back a bit. She had less time and less ability to help, and George knew that he could not care for an 18-month-old while also working as a blacksmith, while also working the land and providing for her. So he made the difficult decision to leave his homestead in Kansas that he and his wife had had so many good times at and had created so many dreams at. And he began making plans to travel with his baby daughter to Iowa, where his in-laws lived and where they could help with Mary Ann. On a cold December morning, George packed a wagon and bundled his daughter inside of it, saying goodbye to his neighbors, the Yorks, and promising to send word when he and Mary Ann arrived in Iowa. They never made it. George and little Mary Ann Longcore never made it to Iowa, but 2 days after they had started their journey on the Osage Trail, visitors to the Bender cabin reported that its owners were very unfriendly and made them feel very unwelcome. These visitors were John Handley, his business associate, and his dog. Now, Handley was a repeat visitor to the Bender Inn, having stopped there many times on his many trips from Fort Scott, and it was deadly cold outside that day, so he expected, as always, to encounter a blazing fire, a hot meal, and a smiling Kate Bender who would be ready to warm him with her dazzling conversation and electric eyes. Handley would be disappointed to find the fireplace dark and cold, almost as dark and cold as Kate, who made no move to start a fire. She instead informed her guests that she would not be cooking and they were on their own. When Handley tried to engage her in conversation, Kate acted as if he hadn't spoken. She ignored him and then just left the front of the cabin and went to the back of the cabin and didn't come back out. And Handley was further stunned when Pa Bender began chasing his dog around with a bat, intent on catching and hitting the animal. When John Handley and his associate tried to start their own fire, they were approached by John Gebhardt, who told them, while he was giggling every other word, that if they wanted to fire, they'd have to buy wood. And so eventually, Handley and his friend decided that they would rather face the freezing temperatures outside than stay someplace where they were clearly not wanted. And John Handley remembers his friend was literally like, they clearly don't want us here. They want us to leave. So let's just go. And as they walked out, John Gebhardt followed them to the door, rifle in hand, smiling in a very unsettling way. Now, obviously, the whole point of this story is to show that it's pretty clear George Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter made it to the Bender cabin, and they probably decided to stay the night there, right? George can't travel as he would if he were alone without a baby, so he's going to have to stop more often, and it made sense that he would have stopped at the Bender cabin because that was one of the few places along the Osage Trail that there was to stop at. And Handley and his business associate arrived at the cabin just 2 days later. And he found it, very dark, very cold. A place that didn't look like it was ready to receive visitors, a place that looked like it didn't want visitors. And it's believed that this was because the Benders had already killed George and his daughter, Mary Ann. And what we'll find out later is what the Benders would do is after they killed their victims, they would put them in a hidden trapdoor that was under one of their mattresses at the back of the cabin. And this trapdoor led to a cellar, and this cellar had been dug out of the earth. It had dirt walls, but the Benders had placed a sandstone slab on the floor or on the dirt of the cellar. After they killed their victims, they would toss them down through this trapdoor into the cellar, and that is where the bodies would remain until the Benders were ready to bury them. Now, there's several reasons why the Benders would have to wait to bury a body. One, if it was during the day, they couldn't just be walking out with bodies slung over their shoulders and digging in their orchard. Two, if it was very, very, very cold, the ground may be too hard and too frozen to dig into. So they would have to wait for a thaw. They'd have to wait for it to warm up a little bit more before they could dig into the earth of the orchard. And so it made sense that the Benders wouldn't want people in their cabin when they had fresh bodies right underneath in the cellar. So they were actually encouraging John Handley and his friend to get the hell out. In March, a man named Alexander York entered the story of the infamous Bloody Benders. Alexander York was a former colonel in the Union Army. He was also a successful attorney and a state senator representing Montgomery County. He also happened to be the brother of Dr. William York, who you'll remember was a neighbor and friend to George and Mary Ann Longcore. Both Alexander and William York will become incredibly important to this story. Alexander had received a letter from his brother, and his brother, Dr. William York, had written that he was making a trip to Fort Scott to visit their father, who was in poor health, and he'd be stopping in Independence, where Alexander lived, to, see his brother and to just stay the night before he started or continued his journey. Dr. William York had also served during the Civil War as a field surgeon, and he'd come home a changed man due to what he had witnessed and what had been done to him. Because during the war, he and a group of other soldiers had been taken prisoner by some rogue Confederate soldiers, and during their captivity, York and 17 others had been tortured, starved, and beaten. Specifically, what seemed to stick with William York above all other things was when he and the other soldiers were tied to a high beam by their thumbs, and they were left hanging there for hours. Some men passed out from the pain, some were dead when they were finally cut down, but William survived, and the memory of the shame of his treatment, along with the guilt of making it when some of his friends had not, this followed him home. Dr. William York told his brother Alexander that he was planning to go to Fort Scott not just to visit their father, but to have some plants sent back to his wife Mary in Onion Creek. So apparently the York family ran a successful agriculture business in Fort Scott, and their nursery was considered one of the best in the region, and William hoped that some plants and flowers and bushes would help Mary and give her a distraction, give her something to focus on, because she was pregnant and very lonely on their homestead with no family nearby and her husband often away for work. What William did not tell his brother Alexander was that he also planned to investigate the whereabouts of his friend and neighbor George Longcore and the Longcore's 18-month-old daughter, Mary Ann, after getting a letter from George's in-laws the previous January stating that the two had never made it it to Iowa. William had also read a story in the paper about a wagon that had been found abandoned outside of Moorhead, which was northeast of Independence, and inside the wagon, clothing had been found that seemed to belong to a man and a small child. William wanted to see the wagon for himself to find out if it was the one George and Mary Ann had been traveling in, and he would be the one to recognize it since he himself had sold it to the Longcours. So William York set off from Independence on March 4th and arrived in Moorhead, where he inspected the wagon and confirmed that it had belonged to George Longcour. He had also discovered that after the wagon had been found in Moorhead, nobody had really done a search for its occupants because they didn't know who it belonged to. It was just an abandoned wagon. But now that he knew it was George Longcour's wagon, Dr. William York felt that a full-scale search needed to be put together and mobilized so that they could search the surrounding areas in the prairies for George and Mary Ann. So Dr. York moved on to Fort Scott, where he spent 4 days with his father, who noticed that William was distracted and constantly deep in thought. And when he questioned his son about this, William did admit that he was worried about his old friend, George Longcour, and he planned to next travel to Osage Mission, taking the route he believed George would have taken when he left Onion Creek. Now, on the way, he would stop at each and every homestead and question its occupants about George and Mary Ann. And if he didn't get answers, he would return to Moorhead and organize a thorough search for clues about their fate. William York bought a new, expensive horse in Fort Scott, and then he headed down the Osage Trail, talking to many people as he went, but getting no answers. When he arrived in Osage Mission, William was no closer to understanding what had happened to the Longcours, but he was filled with a strong belief that they were no longer alive. Now, William had promised his wife and children that he would be back in Onion Creek by March 18th, and on that day there was a knock on the door. But when Mary answered the door, it was not her husband that stood on the other side. It was a man she'd never met before. Now, this man was actually from Moorhead, where the Longcour's wagon had been found, and he wanted to know if William was home because he'd promised to come back to Moorhead to help organize a search for George Longcour and his daughter, but he'd never returned. Now, what it seemed happened was after Dr. William York had made it to Osage Mission and got no answers about anything, he had turned back to return home to Onion Creek. But he was still stopping at different homesteads on the way back, and he had also promised to return to Independence to see his brother, Alexander York, and he'd also promised to return to Moorhead to help organize a search for the Longcours. Now, back in Independence, Alexander York was also concerned about his brother, who did not stop back on his way home. Alexander wrote to their father in Fort Scott, and he was like, hey, William's not here. Is he there? When did he leave? What's going on? And this caused Alexander and William's father to get right on a train to Independence, where he headed right to Alexander's house, telling him that William had been obsessed with finding answers about what had happened to the missing Longcours. Now, the disappearance of Dr. William York would be the catalyst for the discovery of what was happening at the Bender cabin, because William's brothers, Alexander and Edward, would not rest until they found out where he was, if he was alive, if he was dead. And if he was dead, they were going to find out in, a vigilante mob style who had done it to him and make them pay. And in the end, the York family had the money, the power, respect, and political pull to really get things moving in a place where only those attributes would get anything accomplished, because several other people had gone missing before Dr. William York. But it was Dr. York's disappearance that really brought a bunch of eyes to what was happening on the Osage Trail. Alexander York feared from the start that his brother had fallen victim to whatever dark force was stalking the trail, but even he would have no idea of the horrors that the search for William would uncover. And that is where we're going to pick up next time, because there's a lot to talk about still, and it's going to get pretty graphic. But wait, there's more, because it's time for Stephanie's Small Business Showcase. Today's small business comes to us from Cassandra of Kinda Cute Creations. Cassie started this business in 2011 when she was still in high school, and she loved drawing anime-inspired work. She started making small plush creatures by hand, but now she has a sewing machine and embroidery machines, and she's also added jewelry, specifically fun and quirky earrings, which we all know is my favorite. Also, Nev's favorite, my daughter Nev, who's editing this right now, shout out to Nev, loves quirky earrings. So Cassie says she can make anything a plushie as long as she has good reference reference photos, and she can also print her artwork on fabric to make pillows. She says that Pokemon and other popular cartoon characters are what are most requested, but sometimes people do want custom dolls or plushies, and she thinks it's a lot of fun to make something come to life in 3D. Now, I am also a big fan of anime, and I see that Cassie has some Demon Slayer earrings here, so yeah, those are going to have to get bought. Those are going to have to get bought, Cassie. I'm going to need some of them. Toot sweet. Cassie's plushies are adorable. I can't even let my kids see them, or they'll want every single one because they are plushie addicts, especially those axolotls. I don't know why, but for some reason both Aiden and Bella are obsessed with axolotls lately. So I have linked Kinda Cute Creations Instagram in the description box. Message Cassie if you see something you like, if you want something special and personalized made. Show her some love because we support the hell out of each other here. She says right now her Etsy shop is on vacation mode, so there's no point in going there, but on Instagram you can message her and let her know what you want, or if you want something made, and she will respond. So that is it for today's Harloween video. Like the video if you liked it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to come back for the next and final part of the Bloody Benders saga. I will see you very, very soon. Until then, stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay safe. And also, stay spooky. All right? Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly, and so you got to let it go. I got blood.